Welcome back to IME 315. This is the third segment I'm going to talk about on costs. Now what we're going to talk about here are kind of some of the economic terms behind costs. And we're going to consider fixed costs, variable, marginal, and average costs and what they mean. And we're also going to talk about considering all costs. And this is really important because I think historically costs, 100% of all costs haven't been considered in project justification. And I'm going to talk about some of the implications ethically at the end of this discussion. So what we want to do is we want to understand the concepts. I'm not really going to talk a lot about cost estimation models. For this class, we're going to be talking about the costs are going to be kind of given. We may have to derive some of them, but we're not going to go through the estimation. That's going to be something you'll be doing on the job. Now, I say we're going to draw cash flow diagrams, but I think I'm going to leave that till the next section because they get a little bit complicated. Okay, there's various types of costs: fixed cost and variable cost, marginal costs, average costs, etc. We are going to be most concerned about incremental costs, marginal costs, and fixed costs. So I'm going to talk about all of these a little bit at a time. At the end of the day, when we move on in this class, those are the types of costs we're going to be discussing and utilizing in our project justifications. So fixed costs are costs that are constant. No matter what you produce, you have a fixed cost. The cost doesn't change. So things like property taxes, management administrative salaries, even if you produce more or less, unless there's a phase shift, your management salaries aren't going to change. Your fees, your rents, leases, no matter what your production is, your costs aren't going to change. And conversely, variable costs, they change with the output or activity level. So things that we talked about in the last lesson: direct labor costs, direct material costs. So your material cost, the more you make, the more the cost is. The direct labor cost, the more you produce, the more your labor cost is. Now this is this example here, marginal costs and average costs. Marginal cost is the variable cost for the next unit. And average cost is the total cost divided by the number of units. So let me give you an example of this. I did a project for Union Oil, and every year Union Oil would give a Christmas gift to our suppliers or our vendors or whoever we were doing business with. And the gift was a necktie for men. It was a very nice silk necktie made in Italy, and a comparable silk scarf for women. And so I was working with the U.S. Export-Import Credit Agency. It's called USXM. And we sent these ties as gifts to them for Christmas, just the people I was working with. And the first thing they did was they thanked me for the tie, and they asked me what the tie cost, because they were not allowed to accept gifts of more. I don't even remember what the dollar amount was, more than $30 or $40, I believe, at the time. And so these ties had a very high fixed cost. Okay, the setup cost was very expensive. The marginal cost, once you had the thing set up, was literally the material cost per tie and the labor, which was very small. And so if you calculated the average cost, it would include the total cost divided by the number of units, which would include the fixed cost. And ethically, I wasn't trying to bribe them or anything. I just wanted to give them a tie and a scarf. And so I'm not sure what the average cost was, but I did know that the marginal cost was under $30. It was probably about $10 or $15. And that's the number that I told him, because that was what the cost of making that next tie was the marginal cost, the cost of making one more unit. We had already incurred the fixed cost. So let's look at an example here. If we've got, if we're going to, I believe this example is where we're going to have a class, and we're going to, it's like a seminar class, and we're going to provide working materials for each person attending the class. Renting the room costs $225. The materials are $20 for each student that's going to attend the class, and we're going to charge $35 a student. So if we get 0 students, we're still going to incur a cost of $225. So our revenue is going to be $35 times the number of students. Our total cost is going to be $225 plus $20 times the number of students. And so this is what our various, what we look like with profit and loss. So here's our total cost line. This is the purple line. We have a fixed cost no matter how many students we have of $225. And then for each student, that increases by $20. Now our total revenue starts at the origin, it's the blue line, and for each student increases by $35. So we want to be, you can calculate the break-even point, that's where revenue equals cost. Solve for X, turns out to be 15. So we don't want to be in the red area, we want to be in the green area, obviously. But the variable cost line is the orange line. And note that it has the same slope as the total cost line. It just is shifted down by the fixed cost amount. And theoretically, it's not always the case, but theoretically, I think most of the time this is the case, your variable cost will be your marginal cost. So you add one more student, cost you $20 more. So in this example, if we have 15 customers, our profit is 0. We're at the break-even point. And some of the terms I was using, break-even, that's where total revenue equals total costs. Typically, a company can't just get by if they're only breaking even. They need to make a profit because their investors need to get a return. So if their revenue just equals their cost, they can't pay a return to their investors. The investors won't be happy. They want to be in the profit region where you're putting money in the bank, not in the loss region where you're losing money. So if this was an instructor teaching a class, a seminar class, you'd never want to be in the red because it would cost you money to do it. You probably wouldn't do, if you felt you're only going to get 15 students, you probably wouldn't do this very often because you're just not going to do it for free. You want to be in this profit region. You want to make a little bit of money for investing your time in putting this seminar class on. Now, let's talk about two other types of costs, sunk costs and opportunity costs. And the one that's really tends to be confusing for many students is sunk cost. And it's money that you've already spent due to a past decision. So an example of a sunk cost is the price you paid for a car 2 years ago. Now, in terms of making a decision going forward, the sunk cost is irrelevant as to the decision. It's important that you understand it, what you spent, but it doesn't matter what you paid for the car 2 years ago. If you wanted to sell the car today, you're going to be selling it for the market price today. Hopefully, it's not a whole lot different than what you paid for it 2 years ago. An example of this is back, I was doing a project in Colorado several years ago. Actually, it was in the early 80s. And it was a shale oil project. Now, this was a different project than shale oil that you hear about today, where there's fracking going on underground. What this was in Colorado, in the western slope of the Rockies. There was the rock had oil in it, and so what would happen is you would mine the rock. I think the Indians called it the rock that burns. And they would mine the rock, you'd crush the rock, heat it up, the oil would come out, and you'd sell the oil. It was all brand new technology. And so we estimated that the total project would cost about $700 million. And there was 3 or 4 different phases to this. The first phase was to build the mine. The second phase was to build the rock crushing facility, and the third phase was to build, it was called a retort, it was an upgrader where you would heat up the rock and the oil would flow out of it. Each one of these had lots and lots of new technology in it, and we estimated what the recovery rate of oil would be, and then we justified our economics based on that. Well, we estimated the total cost would be $700 million. And the mine, I believe, was supposed to be about $200 million. We spent $500 million on the mine. Then we did a project reevaluation. And we were certainly going to spend more than $700 million on the project. But we'd already sunk the $500 million into the project. And so it was irrelevant in terms of the decision to go forward if we felt that the revenues we had estimated were going to justify the additional investment in the rock crushing facility and the upgrading facility. And so we decided to go forward with the project, spent more on the rock crushing facility, spent more on the upgrading. So overall, it was a poor investment because we spent way more than the $700 million. But the decision to go forward was always made looking forward, not considering the sunk costs. Now, you could argue that if our engineers were doing such a poor job of estimating originally on the cost of building the mine, maybe there was no credibility or very little credibility in their cost estimation going forward on the other 2 parts of the project. There could be some justification in that. Long and short of it was all new technology. Lots and lots of the new technology worked, but a couple of very key components did not work. And we'd estimated we were going to make 10,000 barrels of oil a day. We ended up making about 4,000 barrels of oil a day because some of those new technology components didn't work. And because of that, we shut down the project. So that's sunk cost. And in terms of making a decision, sunk costs are irrelevant going forward. Opportunity costs are a little esoteric. It's like, I think that it's kind of a what if. So what if what's the opportunity cost of paying your house payment rather than going out to dinner? Well, it depends. Probably going out to dinner is not going to get you something comparable to paying the mortgage, unless it might get you a new job if you're going to interview with somebody or looking at hiring somebody. But opportunity costs are esoteric, hidden, and implied. And I may refer to them later on in the quarter, but just be aware that they're out there. They're not super relevant to the balance of this course. I just wanted to point them out to you that they're there. So let's look at, if we want to price some old pumps. If we bought pumps 3 years ago, the purchase price was irrelevant. It's a sunk cost. If we paid $7,000 for it, the storage cost, holding on to them for 3 years, it's a sunk cost. We paid it. If we're looking at selling the pumps, the price we paid for the pumps 3 years ago is irrelevant. The price of new pumps is irrelevant. And a price 2 years ago is irrelevant. The only thing that's relevant is the current price of the old pumps. So if we wanted to sell these pumps today, it doesn't matter that we have $8,000 into them. It only matters that somebody will pay $3,000 for them. It doesn't matter what they listed for and that we got a great deal on them. It doesn't matter what new, in theory, it doesn't matter what new pumps cost. You may want to make a decision: is it worth an extra $9,000 to have a new pump versus a 3-year-old pump? But in theory, that price isn't relevant if the old pump can do the job. So the only things that's relevant here is the current price. It's the price looking forward. Like the example of the shale plant that I was talking about. It didn't matter what we spent for it. The only thing that matters was the cost going forward of building the additional components of the facility. So we have recurring costs and non-recurring costs. And recurring costs are repetitive. Now, it's rent. It's the cost for a product. Non-recurring costs are one-time. They're like fixed costs. The purchase price for real estate, the construction cost for a plant. It's a one-time thing. And the last bullet point says some non-recurring costs can be planned for by buying insurance, turning it into a recurring cost. So a non-recurring cost, it's kind of like, the last bullet point is basically said we could purchase real estate or we could rent the property. We could purchase a building or we could rent the building. On this startup company that I'm looking at, I'm looking at two factories to build. One of them is going to be in the United States, one of them is going to be overseas. And in fact, we are planning on renting the building we're going to put the factory in the United States. And the overseas, they don't have the building we need, so we're looking at renting the land and constructing the building. So it's a large upfront fixed cost, but I'm trying to make it equivalent to the rental cost on the same basis, because we're not interested in owning a building. We're interested in renting a building. The project I'm working on is a technology project. The building is a necessary component of it because it has to house the equipment that we're using. Now, this is very important. Incremental cost. When you're comparing two projects, and when I say it's very important, it's going forward in the rest of the class. This is not the only time you're going to see this. But incremental cost, if you're comparing two projects, you're going to look at the total cost, but what's important is the increment. The increment. So let's say you have two projects, A and B. They're mutually exclusive. You're going to do one or the other. And those are the costs. The incremental cost of doing B versus A is $4,000. So it's important that you if you're going to do one or the other, it's important to know that you're going to spend at least $10,000 because that's the minimum cost. But doing project B has an incremental cost of $4,000. So if you're choosing between two, and we're going to get to evaluating various projects and the components of the various projects. But if we look at two projects, one of them has a purchase price of $10,000, one is $17,500, and an installation cost of $3,500 and $5,000. So your upfront costs, like your fixed costs, are going to be $9,000 more for B than for A. That's the $7,500 purchase price difference and the installation cost. Now, why would you do B versus A? Well, maybe it's a much bigger project, or maybe you're going to save $1,750 a year in maintenance by doing Model B versus Model A. But your utility costs are higher, so your net savings is only $950 a year. $1,750 minus $800. So your net savings of doing B versus A on an annual basis is only $950. So you're going to spend, I don't know if I said $8,000 or not, you're going to spend $9,000 more. You're going to save $950 a year. So you better be holding on to this thing for 8 or 9 years just to break even. And then there's a disposal cost. So once this is over with, you have to get rid of the equipment that you purchased, and it costs you more to get rid of Model A for some reason than you get rid of Model B. Now recognize that this disposal cost is an estimate, and you're estimating what it's going to cost you when you're done utilizing the equipment. If you have a 10-year planned life, probably the most uncertain thing in your evaluation is going to be this disposal cost. The reason I say that is because most projects have not adequately evaluated the cost of disposal, the end of life cost, because it's uncertain, because it's so far in the future, as well as costs just change over time dramatically many times depending upon regulatory requirements. Okay, so the incremental, let's just look between what this means. The incremental cost, the cost of B minus the cost of A. If it's positive, it means that B costs more than A, because this is an incremental cost. So a positive cost means B costs more than A. Now, as you get into the business world, there's going to be commentary about cash costs versus book costs. It's kind of like the difference between net income and cash provided by operations. So net income on the income statement and cash provided by operations. And the primary difference between these two, and we'll get to this in about the 6th or 7th week, is depreciation. So from a stock market perspective, most people look at book costs. They look at the income statement. But from a decision-making perspective, cash is king. So I'm going to treat this class from a decision-making perspective for project justification, and we're going to assume cash is king. I'm going to talk about the impact of depreciation, but we're not going to be looking at book costs. And then finally, I want to get to this. I touched on this a little bit, but we need to consider in project evaluations all types of life cycle costs. And so it's the cost of everything over its life cycle, including retirement and disposal. And so, and I've worked in the energy industry many years. One of the things we've done very poorly is estimate the retirement disposal of an oil well. We don't necessarily properly factor it into the decision to drill the oil well. And for example, I know that there's wells being abandoned right now in the city of Long Beach in Southern California that have cost $2 and $3 million to abandon the well. I can guarantee you that when the well was justified, they never estimated any numbers like that in terms of an abandonment liability. But this is becoming more and more important going forward. to consider the retirement and disposal of an asset when you consider getting involved in the making the investment. And I'm going to tie this retirement and disposal into this last bullet point, but we have two types of costs, internal and external. And internal costs are costs directly incurred by a company, materials, labor, overhead. Now, external costs are not directly incurred by a firm. And I'm going to, this first bullet point, because historically, if you wanted to get rid of something, it was you took it to the dump, took it to the landfill, and basically you paid a fee to get rid of it. That sort of put the cost on society, if you will, especially if it impacts air and water quality and impacts the environment. And as we've gotten more socially conscious, companies are trying to include these external costs and make them more internal so that you provide for those in justifying a project. And if your external costs are extremely high, maybe the project isn't worth doing, but historically those have not been factored in. And so there's a thing called ESG, and some of you may have heard of it. It's environmental, social, and governance. And as companies are trying to become more and more ESG compliant in their business operations, so environmentally, socially, and from a governance perspective, they want to. And governance means, the types of employees that it reflects society, not just one element of society. And so those are being included now, and there's actually ESG departments in some, not even larger companies, but in many companies. In fact, I have in this project that I'm working on, I have literally $2 to $3 million a year budgeted for ESG compliance to make sure that we're doing things properly. Okay, so this is the end of my cost discussion for this week. Beginning next week, we're going to be talking about what we do in justifying projects, how interest rates work, time value of money, and we're going to incorporate costs and revenues into project justification.